Hi, Andreas from Toddle here, and we are on day 3 of our video series Learn Toddle in 7 days. Today we're going to be building a full application. We're going to be building the front end in Toddle, and we're going to be building the back end. And for the back end, we're going to be using Xano.com, which is a very powerful and scalable no-code backend. And as a special treat today, we have Michael from Xano who's joining us to help us set up our Xano backend. So Michael, thank you very much for being here.
Of course, yeah, excited to be here. Let's jump into it.
Excellent. So I've loaded up my Xano account. And again, just like with Toddle, you can go and sign up for Xano for free. So you can go and try that out. And you can run this whole tutorial without even having to pay for it. So that's kind of great. I'm on my dashboard here, and I need to create a new backend for my to-do app, Michael. So what do I do now?
Great, yeah, let's go ahead and let's create a new workspace. I see you have 3 different projects here, so let's create a new one. And give this workspace a name. You can call it to-do list.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then let's just answer these onboarding questions and kind of go through the different onboarding screens here.
Yeah, and I'm just looking for Toddle.
We will add that.
Yeah, sounds great. Sorry about that. And do I want to import data from another service? No, I think I'm starting fresh, right?
That is correct. And then hit get started. And we'll just leave in that user table for now. We actually have a to-do list template, which will help us kind of get started probably about 90% of the way there with the to-do table. So why don't you just do user and hit continue.
Perfect.
You can skip this for now. We have some other marketplace extensions. And finally, user login. So Xano will set up email authentication using JWE tokens. We also have those different social sign-in providers, but we're just making a simple to-do list. So let's do email, hit review,
perfect,
and create your workspace.
That looks great. And we're going to hit create workspace then.
Great.
Well, that was fast.
Very quick, yes. So as you can see, we have our user table. We also gave you some user endpoints that we'll see in a second, but let's go get that to-do list template from our marketplace. So on that left navigation bar, where that house looking thing is, yeah. Let's just go ahead and click in there. And if we scroll down, we should see to-do list there.
There we are.
Yep. So this is a very basic to-do list, but let's go ahead and install this here.
Yes, and that
and hit this
good.
Install button again. Awesome. Great. So this gave us a database table with to-do list items and also a few API endpoints. But let's jump to the database. And let's actually make one modification here. Because if you jump into to-do, you can see we have a task, whether or not it was completed, if it's important. But I believe we want to actually make it so that each to-do list task is related to a specific user. Is that right?
Yeah, I think we want like multiple people to be able to log in and have them see their own task. So basically one was called multi-tenancy on this, right?
Great. Yeah, so let's go ahead, hit that plus button near the top there. And let's add a new field. We'll do table reference.
Oop, there we are, yeah.
And then user. So this will create a relationship to our user table. So we'll able to define that a specific task actually belongs to a specific user. And then we can have users view just their own individual task in our app.
Perfect. What's the next step then to building our to-do list?
Yes, next step is we'll actually jump to the API and we'll start to set up so, only authenticated user can only see their own to-do list. So let's jump into that. Let's actually jump into that to-do list API group in there.
Yeah.
Great. And here are just some basic CRUD operations, but we can actually work with these to start to manipulate our endpoints and build them in the way we want to. So let's start with that get to do right on top. Yeah, so this just gets a record of all those to-do list items, but we can actually ensure that this is filtered so only the user who's logged in can see their own to-do list. So there's a couple things we're going to do. First, on the top where it says public endpoint, let's actually click on that. And all we're going to do here is where it says authentication disabled, we're actually going to enable user authentication, which just means a user has to be logged in to use this endpoint. So let's go ahead and hit save.
That makes a lot of sense, yeah.
Yeah, so now that that token will need to be passed through the header, but because of that, we know exactly who the user is. So if we click on our query all records now, let's actually open that right here, that by custom query, where that white pencil is. Yeah, this actually allows us to do different where expressions to filter our query. So if we hit add conditional here, what we can do is we can hit that drop down and we can look at those to-do fields. So we can say where to-do.userid at the bottom. And on the right, we can say it's equal to, if we type in auth, A-U-T-H, and grab that ID. Exactly.
So this basically says that you're going to get all the records, but you're only going to include the ones where the to-do items user ID is equal to the auth ID.
That is exactly correct.
And as I understand, that basically means that only the ones that are tied to my user is going to be the one I see, and you're going to see a completely different set when you call this endpoint, right?
Yes, that is exactly correct.
Perfect. So can I save this?
You can save this, yeah.
Perfect. Right. Is there anything more we need to do with this?
So let's hit save one more time, just on that right side. I know we have a little too many save buttons, but yeah, now basically we can go ahead and publish this. And you can hit publish there, and yeah, that's live and ready to use.
That's nice. So is there anything else we need to do before our API is ready?
Yeah, so do we also want to set up creating a to-do task, editing and deleting one as well?
Yeah, I think we're going to definitely creating and checking them off is all we're going to cover in this video. And then I think people can go and explore like deleting tasks, etc. Right? So just list, create, and edit will be the three.
Okay, great. So let's jump back into to-do here. And that top post that says to do, that'll be our create one. So let's jump in there.
This one, yeah.
Correct, yep. And so just like we did with our get, let's click that public endpoint. And let's require
that back to user authenticated again?
Yes,
yes,
that is correct. Good. Cool. So now that we've turned on user authentication, let's jump into that add record function. Just click on that. And instead of at the bottom where user ID is mapped up to that input, we can change that to that auth ID.
So I'm doing this the same, I'm guessing the same way as before. I'm typing auth. Oh.
Yes, exactly.
And ID. Okay, well, that's very easy. And save?
And save, correct.
Perfect.
And now we can go ahead and publish that. So what that will do is based on that user auth token, so who's logged in, it'll make sure to create that to-do record that belongs to that specific user.
Perfect. And so we have the last endpoint. I assume we also have to do some changes to that. The one that lets us edit the task, like check it and uncheck it, etc.
That is correct, yeah. So let's jump into that bottom post down there.
And I'm guessing we're doing the same public again?
That is correct.
Okay, I got one.
Great. And so with this setup, we're going to do something a little different here. So we're actually going to first check to make sure that this to-do task actually belongs to the user before we're going to let them edit the record. So let's actually hit the plus button in the function stack.
This one?
Correct. And if we go to database request right at the top under all functions and find get record, we're going to go ahead and get this record from to do.
Yeah.
Perfect. And so right here on the right side, you can see we're looking up the to-do record by the ID. The field value is going to be our ID input. Great. And what this is going to do, it's going to give us information on the record, which includes that user ID. So we'll be able to just enforce that auth ID, like we've been doing in the other endpoints, is the same as the auth ID on this record. So let's save this. And order of operations matters in the Xano function stack. So let's actually, on the left side of that function, let's drag the get record above our edit record.
Here we go. Yeah.
Correct. Awesome. And one more thing, let's actually do that enforcement I talked about, which we can accomplish with something called a precondition. So now if you hit that little plus button next to get record to do, awesome.
Yeah.
And you can go into utility functions, which is fourth from the bottom. And in here we should see precondition. It's going to be, yep.
There we are. Yeah.
Awesome. So preconditions enforce that something has to be true. If the condition is not met, it will throw an exception and prevent the rest of the function stack from executing, so that if someone for some reason was trying to edit a task that didn't belong to them, this would stop them. So the way we do that is where it says nothing defined, and there's that blue pencil. We can go ahead and open that up.
Yeah.
And just like we did in the query all records, we can go ahead here and let's actually grab that variable to do _1. Just go ahead and select that.
This one? Yeah.
Yeah, and in Xano, we can use dot notation on variables. So if you just go ahead and click in there and go ahead and put a period and then say user _ID.
Oh, there we are. Okay.
Very nice.
What?
And then on the right side, we can go ahead and grab that or put that auth ID again.
That makes sense.
Perfect.
Okay, so what we're saying here is that we're going to get a record out, the one with the right ID, and then here we're going to say we need this precondition, which is the one record we were going to update, also needs to actually have the user ID that's the auth ID. So basically saying that record also have to be owned by us. Otherwise, this precondition is going to be false, right? And what happens if the precondition is false then?
So if the precondition is false, then we can actually even have it'll throw an error. We can have a custom error message here, which can be defined on the right side where it says error message. You can say something like, in the right panel there, yes. You can say something like, this is not your task, please try again, or something in that nature.
This is not your task. That's what we're going for.
Correct,
and we'll do an exclamation point. Yeah. Perfect. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. You can
and
make sure.
Error type access denied, I'm guessing.
Yeah.
Yeah, perfect. Okay.
And you can just make sure to hit save there in the bottom right.
Yeah.
And one other thing we want to do here, I think, so in our edit record, I think we probably only care about toggling if something was completed or not for the sake of this exercise.
Yeah.
So right now we're editing all the fields, but we can actually hide those from the API here on your right panel. So if you just hover there where it says, yep, task, you can start to, yes, exactly.
Okay. Why? That makes a lot. So this basically says now the only thing we'll actually change is the completed status.
That is correct, yes.
Perfect. And if people want to come back and change this and be able to update other things, they can just go open this up and change that back to where they want. Perfect.
Yes.
Perfect.
Yeah, so save this. Make sure to publish it so the changes are live. And that should be all we need for the different to-do APIs.
That is perfect. Well, Michael, thank you very much for taking time to joining us and help us show us how to do this in Xano.
It was my pleasure.
I really appreciate it.
Yeah, of course.
Thank you. Now that we've got our Xano backend all set up, let's get into Toddle and see how we're going to build the front end for this to-do list project. So I've got my project list loaded up here, and I'm going to create a new application. And as always, I'm starting from the blank template and calling this to-do list. That's with a lot of caps lock. Let's just try it like that. Right. So the very first thing we want to do, because we haven't created any users or anything in our Xano backend, the first thing we really need to do is be able to sign up as a user, right? This kind of makes sense to start with because it's also where the user journey start, and also until we have any users, we can't really do anything else in the app, right? Everything else requires to be authenticated. So we're going to create a login form first. So instead of using our home page here, I'm going to go and create a new page. Now, we haven't really talked about pages much before. Like everything we've built up until now has been on a single page. But now we want to move into a slightly more complex, bigger application we're building. It's not big, it's just bigger. And we need to add at least the sign up page and I think a login page as well. And then of course our actual to-do list. So we need 3 pages for this project. So I'm going to go into pages here and create a new one. We're going to call it a sign up. And we've got this page section here. And you can see here the path that this page is on. So that basically means that whenever you go to your domain, like in this case, it's going to be todolist.toddle.site/signup. This is the page that's going to be shown. And based on what that path part of the URL is, which is the bit that comes after the slash, it will show a different page in Toddle, assuming that page exists. Otherwise, it'll show what's called a 404 page or not found page. So in this case, this is going to be the page that shows when we go to /signup, and we will then link to that. We'll redirect to that if you're not logged in, right? There's a ton of other things you can do on this. We don't need to cover any of it right now, so we'll cover that later. All that we care about now is that this /signup is where we're going to find this sign up page, right? I'm going to start in this case by adding a form before we add the API, because we're not fetching data from the API, we're sending data to the API. So until we've got the form up and running, we really can't do that much with it. So I'm going to go and click add element. And I can use I'm going to add form here. And the form comes with like a few input elements and button already added in this case. You can, of course, remove them if you don't need it, or just change them to whatever you need. So in this case, we need what do we actually need for sign up? Let's go and check Xano again. So on the users, this bit was auto generated, so we haven't really looked at it before. But we've got some endpoint here with auth, and auth sign up is probably the one we're looking for, right? It's saying we need 3 fields, name, email, and password, right? So we need to add 3 fields here. So instead of first name, we're just going to call this name. And then we should actually bind these 2 variables. So we covered that a little bit in the last bit where we said, well, we covered that search input to a variable. We're going to take that a little bit further today. So I'm going to create 3 variables in Toddle. And I touched on this a little bit in the last video, but I think it's probably worth covering again. Variables are for storing what we call temporary data. So where, for example, your to-do list, all those items are going to live in Xano in a database there. Those are not temporary. Like you can technically, delete them in that sense, but they are persisted in a database where your variables here only live for as long as you've got the application open. And if you got like 2 tabs open with the same app, it could have different like values in those variables. So it's very temporary. In this case, it's just for holding like what is the value you've typed into name, what is the value you typed into email in this case. There's a ton of other use cases, and we'll start getting into what they are, and especially in the next video we will go into deep what you can actually do with this. But we're creating the variable here because we need to hold the value that people are typing into this input field so that we can use it in the API afterwards. So we're creating 3 variables. We're creating the name, and we're starting them out as just an empty string. Then we're creating an email, again starting as an empty string. And finally we're creating a password like that and starting out as an empty string, right? So now that they're here, we can take our first input, that's going to be our name input, and we can bind that to our name variable. And what that actually does, the bind here is actually just a shortcut for 2 other things it does. It says this value, And this is all like the input here is an HTML input element. So when you provide an input element in HTML with a value attribute, it sets the value of that input. And again, when you're getting it out of it, it's called value. So this is not a sort of a toddler specific thing. This is a HTML web specific thing, right? And we are just using the platform here because it lets us achieve what we need to do. So what it actually does when you bind the variable, it first sets this value attribute, and we can just look at the formula, and it sets it to the name, variable, right? And the other thing it does is that it creates this, it listens for this input event on it. So whenever you're typing into it, you're triggering this input event. And this essentially lets us know in total that, hey, the user was typing in. We haven't really talked much about events. Events essentially let you define how your applications should respond to different user actions. So in this case, it is the action of the user typing into the input. It could also be click. It could be any sort of mouse action, moving, pressing down, up. You can see here we've got a ton of categories with a lot of different like events you can react to, right? There's like a ton of different things. There's even custom events that can be triggered from different components. Like there's so many different things, right? But this specifically one, the input event, essentially is every time you type or like every time you hit a key while you're in an input field, right? It doesn't even matter if it's a backspace. Like every time you make any sort of keystroke in an input field, it'll trigger this input event. And the way toddle kind of works is that it forms this sort of loop between the application and the user. And I've tried to sort of show what I mean here. What basically happens is that you will, let's say, when we load a toddle component, we can use the example from last video, right? Where as soon as we loaded the component, this auto fetch we had said, I'm gonna go and fetch some fetch an API, and that's technically an action, right? We didn't trigger it; it's automatically triggered, but there's an action that goes saying, go and fetch the data from that API, and then when that come back, our API data gets updated, and when the data gets updated, Toddle automatically says, right, then I need to update the UI, like because I need to check if anything changed, if there's any formulas anywhere that basically want me to update the way the UI is. And Toddle does all that. You never have to think about actual rendering the UI. You just need to make sure you set the data, and if you set all the formulas, the different parts as formulas, Toddle takes care of the rest, right? So you render the UI, and then when this UI changes, you're generally just prompting the user, right? What should I do now? What is the next thing we're going to do? So that could be a user input into that input field. Maybe the user's typing in. That generates this event. We're saying, okay, there's a user event, and then if we've added any actions that will happen based on that event, which is what I'll show you in a second, how we're doing that, they will be executed by the application, by Toddle, and that might lead to updating the data again, probably will. And then we render those changes and we go back, the user makes another action, right? This is a little bit of a simplified model. There's also cases where an action might trigger another action and actually generate another event. So there are some ways you can do loops down here, but this is sort of the general circle that happens. The user interact with the page react, renders those changes, whatever the changes are, onto the screen, and then the user interacts again, right? And you form this sort of continuous loop of interaction. So in this case, what we're saying here is when the user triggers this input event, and just to be clear, the user will trigger events all the time. We might just not be telling your application to do anything about it. So all these other events are also technically triggered. It's just that we don't care, so we'll leave them alone. It's only once we add in here, and we click on this, when we add an actual workflow to be executed, it's only there it matters. Until then, they kind of just get triggered and ignored. And that's perfectly normal. That's how the browsers are meant to do it, right? So in this case, what the input does is basically say, I'm going to set the name. So we put the value into the variable value into the input, and whenever the user triggers an input change, we update the value again using a formula here to extract the new value from the event. So that's the new value in the input that you typed is added in, and it sort of formed this loop of, again, us rendering a value into the input, user typing again. That whole happens all the time. In reality, you don't see it happening because it just looks like you're normally typing it into an input. But if we now go look at our name variable, we can see that that now says Andreas, right? And if I change this variable any other way, so I might reset it later, the input value will also be reset to that value. So they form this sort of binding where if you change one, the other one's affected. That's why we call it bind. But really, it's just a shortcut for setting up that event and that value binding. I'm also gonna quickly in here in attributes. We've got a lot of other ones on inputs that are we've got a type, it's text, that's actually fine. Title is like a little sort of tells the browser what is this actually, and also when you hover it, you get like a little overlay with some more information. It's kind of optional, you don't need to have it, but we'll go say your input name. Right, the value, we'll leave that, and then in this case, we'll just say full name. This will be the placeholder text. So if there's nothing in if it's empty, just like you can see here in the current last name, which is going to change to email, that's what it's going to show. Right, that's the placeholder text right here. That's all good for me. I'm going to go and change the second one here. It's going to say email. And I'm going to change this input. I'm going to bind that to email. Change it to an email input. Like an email input and a text input are almost identical. The difference is that if you're on a mobile device, that's the biggest difference anyway. If you're on a mobile device, it'll show a slightly different keyboard. So it's really good to get the types right because it really helps people on mobile devices, right? And most users of most apps are on mobile still today. And the other thing is like for things like autocomplete with passwords and stuff, especially for sign-up and login being slightly more important. Again, it tells these other systems like your password manager, there's an email input, so I should probably put in the email. That's what I suggest, right? So getting these right doesn't seem to do much when you're building the app. It can actually make a big difference for the user. I will just put a placeholder here for the email that says email address. Right, there we go. Then I actually need one more because we also need a password. So I'm just going to grab this label. In this case, actually, if you notice the input is inside the label, that's a little trick. That means that if I click on the name and the label as well, it actually focuses that input. And it also tells the browser that that label and that input are connected. So it's actually quite a nice little way of putting, if you put the input into the label, the browser already knows that those are connected. It's really nice shorthand. Yeah, I'm going to drag this down by holding the Option or Alt key on my keyboard and dragging, and that duplicates the element. And then here in email, I'm changing this to password. We're doing all the same things again. We're binding this to password instead of email. We're taking it type password. Now here, that actually really does matter, right? Because that obviously means that it's going to hide the password input. So that's quite important, especially for password, to make sure you get that right. But you should do it for all of them, right? Password input and placeholder secret password. Right. So that all works. Let's just do a little bit of layout. So right now I've got this sort of form cramped all the way up on the left side of my screen, which is not what I want. So we're going to start by taking the outer div here, right? And I just hit A. There's a ton of shortcuts in Toddle. I'll link to a place where you can see them. There's a ton of shortcuts in Toddle that you can use. I sometimes instinctively use them instead of clicking. So bear with me if I accidentally do that again. But we're going to the starting tab here. I'm going to set this to have a min height of 100%. And the reason why I'm saying minimum height is because we're designing for responsive websites, right? And they're going to be in mobile phones. They're going to be in on big websites with big 4K monitors, all sorts of places. So you need something that really works on very tiny screens and very large screen at the same time, right? Especially something like a to-do list. There's no reason why that wouldn't work on a phone. And I can't actually guarantee that my screen is always going to be bigger than this password input, especially if you're on a phone and it triggers up the keyboard, right? When you type this, it takes up half the screen. So on a small phone, this might not actually be enough to be shown on the screen at the same time, especially if I'm adding like a sign-in heading and stuff, which I probably should, right? So just making sure that I'm not setting height 100%, so it absolutely cannot be bigger than that. I'm saying max mean height. I'm saying you should at least be 100%. You should at least take up the whole screen. But if you need to take up a bit more, just scroll. It's fine, right? And now I can go and put this in the middle where I kind of want it to be. And let's just see. And this sort of scales down pretty fine, right? We don't need to go further than this. We're 267 pixels, right? Like below that, there aren't really any devices. So this kind of works on a large device and it's fine on a small one as well, right? I'm just going to add here a heading 1, and we're going to move it all the way up to the, we're actually going to put it inside the form. That's fine. And we're going to say sign up. Sign up now. Right. So now we've actually built our sign up form, right? Actually, maybe we should have a link here that says, let's just do that. We're going to add a link that says already have an account, go to log in, right? So I think we'll add a paragraph where it says already have an account ? And then a link that says go to log in, right? So we are going to add a paragraph element, which is the short letter here is just P. And again, this is, we talked about this a few times. These are semantic elements. That means they have a semantic meaning. By that I mean, it tells the user and me and screen readers that, this is a paragraph. It don't have any functional meaning. You could put a div or a span or whatever you want in here. And same thing with label, right? It's a way that sort of tells like, this is a label for an input, right? For that input. So it ties a specific meaning. It doesn't change the way it functions. In this case, a little bit because we click on it, change the focus. But on that, it doesn't really change the function. It just kind of semantically informs both the reader, in case it's a screen user, and the browser of what this is. All right. So in this case, on the paragraph, we are saying already have an account, right? And then inside this paragraph, we're going to add a link. And a link in HTML is actually called an A for anchor tag. It's also one of those names that, if we're being honest, didn't quite, I don't think quite worked out as well as it should. There we go. And we're going to just do this. And then here we'll say for the text here, I just changed the paragraph styling so it would be inline. So it changed it to flex instead of text, right? We've been using flexbox for everything. This also kind of makes sense for this case. So here I'm first going to change... go to login. Right. And then on the A, and again, A is a function element in HTML. It is a link. So if you give it an attribute called an href, and we're sort of back with a lot of these HTML naming conventions, right? And we kept them in toddle because we wanted to stay with the actual web platform. Some of the names are kind of weird, right? This is a hypertext reference. But it just means the URL you're linking to, right? So it's just, you kind of remember it, and it usually isn't too much of a deal. But if it's the first time you're seeing, it's not going to make any sense, right? At least SRC, or source on image, makes some sense, but href, I think, is one of those that you just kind of realize that that's how it's always been, and there's not a lot we can do with it without breaking convention, right? So we're using the href here, and what we want to set it to is our /login, right? So when I click this, I'm going to go to the login page. Now, we haven't created the login page now, so we can't really use it, but that just means that when that's ready, it's going to take it to the login page, and we'll have one on the login page. Goes back to the sign up page, right? Right. So now that I've got now we've got that set up, that's all good. Now we actually need to sign up, right? That's the last part. So I am going to create a new API here and called sign up. And then I need to go back to my Xano setup because that's where I had this auth sign up. And I'm just going to copy the whole endpoint URL here. And I'm going to paste it into toddle. And then I also saw here that this is a post request, right? That is important. Like whenever you're sending these HTTP requests, which they're called, you need to get the right verb, like the get, post, delete, etc. is called a verb, and you need the right one for each API, and it'll always tell you, right? So in this case, it says post, and we'll change this to a post request. Now, one thing you'll notice when we do that is that it turns off the auto fetch by default, because generally post requests are using when you're creating something on the server, like a new resource. In this case, it's myself, right? I'm signing up and creating a user on the server. So we don't want to auto fetch. We don't want it to just keep creating things, right? That has to be triggered by a deliberate action. Like you can turn it back on, but you got to be very aware that that's something you actually want to do, right? It's generally not what you're trying to achieve, right? So we've got that. That's why we're not seeing any response, because now that we turn auto fetch up, it's not automatically being called, right? Now the other thing we need from this is we need the text, email, the name, email, and password. These are being passed in as parameters in the body. So I'll show you how to do that. Whenever you're making a post request, you can send along a body, like what is the actual data that I want you to create, right? Because post is generally create. And get doesn't have that. So if you use the standard get request, there is no body. It doesn't have a body, and you can't send it along, right? So we'll add that here. And what we want to do is create an object that has 3 properties. It's going to be name. And I'm going to put in the name variable here, right? The next one is going to be email. And I'm getting these names, like the name, email, password, right? I just name, email, password. I took them right here from Xano, right? So they have to match exactly right, both in letters and case. Like computers are not like forgiving at all. You got to get every single character just right. Otherwise it won't work. That's just how it is, right? So we're going to put name, email, password. And we're using the password. So what I'm saying here is that when we go to make this quest eventually, which we haven't done yet, right? Which we'll do when you submit the sign up form, whatever the value of my email, name, and password variable is what I'm going to use inside this request. And those values were set every time we typed into those inputs, right? So right here, we've got name, email, and password, right? All good. That should work. I'm going to say, oh, I can't hit my little button there because I'm in the way. That's fine. We'll use escapist.net instead. So now this should be all set up. Let's try that. So because I'm in a form, normally I might go and say, well, there's a button. I'll do a click on that button, right? And that makes sense. But forms have a nice little thing that they can do where they actually understand a little bit about what's inside them. So if you use this form element, you get some things for free. Like, for example, this is a submit button. It's a button where I added an attribute of type submit. And if you have one of those in type of your form, whenever you click on it, the form's going to say, it's a submit. And then the form actually generates a submit event. But you can also generate that by hitting enter inside any of these. There's a lot of ways you can do it. So you actually get some of that keyboard interaction and functionality for free with forms. So it's always kind of nice to use the native HTML elements whenever you can, right? We could have built all this functionality in Toddle without using a form, but now we don't have to, right? So I'm going to pick the form, and I'm actually add the event here rather than on the submit button. And the event I'm looking at here is this submit event. So when I click the button, the form's actually going to generate the submit event. The prevent default comes by default, ironically, in Toddle. And prevent default basically says, it tells the browser saying, whatever you were normally going to do when this thing happened, if there's any default browser behavior, don't do that. The default browser behavior for forms is actually to load the whole page over again, because they kind of built from a time when you would type in a URL and saying, this is like a post action to a URL, and it would then go to that URL and try and it was a whole way. Nobody really builds websites that anymore. So it's not, exactly deprecated, but it's pretty abandoned. So whenever you use a form submit, now you kind of have to do this prevent default. Now, Toddle supports the old way of doing it. Like if that's what you want to do, there might be cases where it's valid. So we're not actually preventing you from using that. what we did instead is just saying we're just going to prop in the prevent default always, and then you can remove it if you want the actual standard browser behavior, right? But I'm pretty sure you want. And so in here, we're going to call our API. So I'm just going to click this, right? Now I could now go and say what should happen on success and error. We're going to ignore that for now. We'll do that after. We're going to try and sign up. And if we're successful, then we'll say, well, what should we do afterwards, right? So let's go into test mode. We click the little test app down here. Let's go do that. I'm pretty happy with Andreas. I'm going to change my password to andreas@toddle.dev. And then we'll put in a password of password, but it's with a capital P. Yeah. That's not a password I use anywhere else. So it's not so bad here. All right, I'm going to click on submit. And we can see that nothing happens. But that's actually not so weird because we just said call the API. We didn't say, and then what, right? We don't know what to do with it. So let's press T. Let's open our API. And it says weak password detected. Okay, well, that's fair enough. It was a pretty bad password. But this also gives an opportunity to actually show the user if there's an error, right? It would be nice to show for the user that, there's a problem here, right? So I am going to close this. But now we have that data. Because we made the request, the data is still there. I'm just closing the window, right? So inside my form, I'm going to go and add a other paragraph. And this is my error paragraph. This only gets shown if there's an error, right? And the text we want to show inside it, we're going to again use a formula. Remember, whenever we use a formula, we're not saying what is the value as much as where should you find it, right? Or how should you get it, you could also say, right? So we're opening the formulator, and then I'm going to say I'm going to get my signup API, error in this case, because we got an error. We didn't get the data, right? And then message in this case, right? And now we've got this weak password detected. I'm going to take this and style it a bit. I think we'll start. I'm just going to move myself over to the left. Let's start by giving it a background color. We're going to make like a little alerty type. We'll make it red and kind of 300. Yeah. Change the color here to, we'll do a dark red, I think. 600, maybe 700. 700 is better. Then I'm going to add some padding here of 16 pixels, both places. Gives it a little bit more of a sort of oomph, if you will. Like, makes it a little bit clear. Radius is of like 8 pixels, rounding it off a little bit. That looks pretty good. And we're going to add a border. And then the color here should be, but the default is just like 1 pixel. We can change the color here. I think we're going to pick the same red, and then we'll maybe bump this up 1 pixels to 2 pixels, right? So this looks, hey, okay, maybe it's actually a little bit aggressive since it was just like a wrong password, but you know, we'll stick with it for now. When you're going through and doing this, like, go and do all the styling you want, make it your own. It's by far the sort of nicest way of doing this, right? Actually, for the form, maybe we'll set a width of like 600. Is that too much? That was much too much. Let's do, there we are, 400. That's still a lot. Maybe actually, maybe we should go all the way down to 300. Right, well, let's stick it at 300 because that sort of keeps it nice. Let's just take these inputs and say 100%. Do the same for these, right? So we're just setting them all to be 100% of the container, which in this case is the label, but the label is just set to be however big the width is, right? So now we've got this more layout. And actually, maybe I'll submit. Let's go and change that name on that button to sign up. And maybe we'll change the button width to 100% as well. So we get this nice wide sign up. Right. Now we've done a bit of styling, so we think we can, we're okay with this. Now I'm going to select this P tag because if we don't have an error, we don't want to show it at all, right? We only want to show this element if there was an error coming back. Otherwise, it shouldn't be there. So I'm just going to go into attributes and say show here. You can also right click the element. It's just that I put my picture on top. So I can go and find it over here. I'm going to say show, and we'll say sign up error. And it's fine. It's just like, it doesn't need to be like, it says it should be true or false, but the reality is like any value that's not null or false is just going to be considered true. So it's perfectly fine just clicking the error here and leaving it, right? So that means that only show this if there's an error. Now, and if I, for example, go and refresh, I'm just refreshing my whole browser and loading it again, it's going to be gone because the API is now not called, right? So let's go and try again. Let's choose a better password, right? Andreas at toddle.dev and password with a capital 123. Now, please don't choose password the way I do it in this demo, right? It is a demo. Pick your password. Actually, ideally use a password manager, right? Let's try that. And we are going to exit test mode. I'm going to click out here, and we're going to go look at our sign up. And we can see now we got a positive response, right? We've got our data back, and we got an auth token. And it's a big, long, weird one that doesn't seem to make much sense. And that is very much on purpose. It has to be long because it's encrypted and essentially contains a lot of information about the fact that we're logged in our authentication session. So what we need to do with this token is we need to send this token along every time we ask Xano for any data, right? So if I want to say, get me all my to-do list, what we'll get to do in a second, right? It's going to say, right, but do you have a token, right? And we're going to say, I want to create a new one. It's going to say, well, you need a token to do that. Unless we send a token like this one along every single time, it's not going to allow us to do that. And it also comes with a built-in expiry. So we can only, we can use this for a certain amount of time. Eventually it's going to expire and we're going to have to log in again, right? So in order to do that, we need to store this token in a secure way. So we're not going to store it in a variable. Because if I refresh, I don't want to log in again, right? So that's not the greatest way of doing it. The best way to store a secure token like this is actually using a cookie. And you probably already, if you don't know anything else about cookies, you know it's the thing that you always have to say you like on websites, right? But we're going to use a secure cookie, and we're going to use a special kind of cookie, which is a secure cookie, and that actually cannot be read by the client application once you've set it. So I'm going to go down here and I'm going to say, well, on success, when this event is successful, I want to trigger a workflow. So I'm going to pick that. And in that workflow, I want to set my session cookie. And the access token I'm setting here is going to be taken from my data. So I'm going to get into sign up and data and auth token, right? I also need expires in, and I'm going to say I need to give it some time. Now, depending on what you log into, where you're getting the token, Toddle might be able to do this automatically. There are some tokens called JWTs, a lot of systems use, and we can basically open them up and look inside, and it'll say there's an expiry. And this is all perfectly secure. Unfortunately, Xano doesn't use JWTs. So we can't do this in this case. You needed to tell us like what is the expiry. It has to be done here, right? But I'm just gonna say 3600. That's so it takes 60 by 60. That's actually I'm gonna do the math here because I'm bad at math. So we're gonna just multiply. We're gonna say right. So there's 60 seconds. 60 seconds. Times that's a minute, and there's 60 minutes an hour, right? So that's an hour. Let's leave it an hour. Like, I don't know, Xano probably has a specific timeout already set, and I should probably look that up, but I actually don't want to do that now. So you can go and check in Xano and say what is the expire in their token, and then you should actually set that. Right now I'm just setting it to 1 hour. I'm not 100% sure if it's above or below. So this is obviously not the best way of doing it, right? You should really figure out what the expiry is if you know, right? Good. So I'm going to say that's all good. And just close those two. So you can see there's a success and error on this one as well. And that's because whenever you set a cookie, what we actually need to do is make a request to Toddle's to Toddle's backend and say, hey, I'm storing this cookie. And Toddle will then say, great, I'm going to store that cookie. I'm going to store that value in a cookie for you. So there's a time delay, right? It's not instant. We need to wait for it to succeed before we can do the next step. So that's why we're having another workflow here, right? When it succeeds, well, what do we want to do? Well, we're basically done, right? It all works. We're going to say go to URL, which is an action that comes with Toddle, and you can just give it a URL and we'll go there. In this case, we don't need to give it a full URL. If it's on the same site and the same app, you can just give it a partial URL, which is this slash, right? Great. So I'm gonna say okay and okay and okay. Right. So let's go and test this. I'm gonna open this in a new tab. And the first thing I noticed is that I didn't set my background color. Let's just go and do that. The reason here is because we always show one in Toddle. We just need one. We default to dark mode. But we haven't actually set the background color of the div, so I'll just do that. We'll go into styling and say color and then gray 800. That's actually not great. Let's do 900. Let's make it proper dark mode. Right, that looks good. So let's go refresh that. Right, now we've got our dark one, right? So I've already created my account, so I'm just going to go and delete that user. So I'm going to go to Xano, database, users here, and I've got one here. I'm going to choose that and say delete. There we go. So otherwise I would get an error saying user already exists, right? I'm going to go and try again. Andreas at toddle.dev and password 123. Gonna say sign up, and now we get redirected to the home page, right? Because our login was successful. We saved the token as a cookie. So now we successfully logged in or signed up. We can go to Xano and have a quick check, and we can just refresh this page and see that we have indeed a user called Andreas with this email. So it definitely did work. Now, the next bit for us is to go and create this this bit right here, right? But before we can do that, we need to be able to make requests logged in, right? And we got the cookie. That's pretty good. Now, there's one little issue that this bit right here in the Toddle editor is running inside what's called an iframe, which we will probably cover at a later point in these courses. But basically, it means you're running an application inside another application. That's all good, but for security reasons, browsers say, well, then you can't use cookies. That means we can't actually make authenticated requests. So what we need to do is we need to install a browser plugin. So we're going to go here. I'm in Chrome, so I think it's called the Chrome Web Store. There we are. And I'm going to search for Toddle. Right. And right here, this Toddle plugin, need to go and install that. I have already got installed, so you don't need to do it again. All this plugin does, at least today, we might add functionality later, but all we're doing that now, all this is doing is saying, whenever you have a Toddle app you're building inside the editor, it is perfectly okay to send along authentication code with that. It only works on the Toddle side. We're not like circumventing security anywhere else, don't worry. And now that that's installed, I can actually go and make authenticated requests in here. Now, in the plugin version today, it can only read cookies, it can't set them. So in order to be logged in, you need to open this preview page and do either login or sign up there. Once you've done that, you can go back to your Toddle editor and you'll be authenticated, right? But doing the actual login in like here in test mode won't actually save that cookie. So that's just one thing to be aware of. I think we can fix that in future versions of plugins, but for now, that's just the limitation to be aware of. Like, you need to go and actually do the login in preview mode, and then can you come back and build and keep on building in Toddle, right? So that actually looks pretty good. I think before we go and build the actual site, let's just build the login site, because sign up and login is different. Like they're calling different APIs in Xano. So what we actually want to do is create a different site. We always said here with /login, but it's going to be like the same, right? It's going to do almost everything the same. So instead of creating a new one from scratch, I'm going to open my files over here. I see this sign up page and I'm going to right click that and I'm going to say duplicate, and I'm going to call it login. And also the path is going to be login, right? Because that needs to match the, and then we're going to just say duplicate, and we get exactly a copy of exactly the same page, right? But now I can say login to do, just login. This name thing, we don't need that anymore, because we already know your name from when you signed up. So I can delete it over here as well. And my sign up here is going to be called login, and it's going to be auth login. I got that from Xano when I snooped around earlier. Let's have a look here. Auth login. And if we look, it's only email password. But other than that, it works exactly the same way, right? So obviously the body shouldn't get a name. We're going to delete that as well. It's just the email password. Everything else should work the same way. So just go and check login, login, login. When I submit the form, this says call sign up. That obviously doesn't make sense. We're going to change it to login. Then we're going to set our session cookie again and say login data. We haven't done the login. Let's just do that. I can do this in test mode. As I say, it won't save the cookie, but I haven't done that bit yet. But I'll still get the results. So we'll go into test mode and say Andreas at toddle.dev pass 3, and we'll exit text mode and have a look, and it says invalid credentials. Maybe I don't know my credentials. Can't remember our credentials. Okay. Let's just go and go the long way. Andreas the toddle password. Right. Okay, that was definitely my password. Okay, well, so it pretty much worked because it did the redirect, right? Let's just check again. Login. Not quite sure why it redirected. Thought we hadn't said that bit yet. Because we already had the, yes, perfect. And we'll say sign up data. This should be login data auth token. Right. Other than that, it is all correct. So now our login should work. Now, let's just go. I need to go back to login because now we redirected in here. Let's just do a quick refresh. Right. So now that we're on the login page, we want to change this paragraph right here to say don't have an account yet. And then this right here is going to be sign up now, exclamation point. And of course our href here is going to be /sign up. So all we did here was basically say, like, copy the same page, because login and sign up are almost exactly the same. They're just calling different APIs, but all the logic and all the flows are identical, right? So we just went and changed that, and now we have a login page, and we can go and try that out. We can say, and well, first of all, we can say the link here works. I can go back and forth between these two, and I can say Andreas at toddle.dev and password 123, and it'll log me in and turn me to the actual homepage. So that all works. We're a good while in, and we've now actually gotten to the bit that makes it a to-do app, right? This is quite normal when developing. There's usually quite a lot of these standard things that needs to be done. The great thing is that once you've done it once, just like I did with the login page, You can just copy that onto the next one, right? But I wanted for this video to show you how do we build these things from scratch, right? So once you've done that once the way you like it, you can use it here. You can even copy it to your other apps, right? So you don't need to do all that work every single time you make an app. So I'm going to go back to my home page. I can actually open the file menu by pressing Command K. That's a little shortcut, and I can just search for home page to navigate there really quickly. That can be really nice once you get into Toddle. Having these little shortcuts that helps you move about quicker can be really, really helpful, right? So just like we did with the newsfeed API in the last video, we're going to start by adding our API, and I'm going to call this one to-dos, and I'm going to go back to Xano, and here in APIs and under to-dos, I'm going to use this get to-dos because this is the one that fetches me a list of to-do items. And I can copy the URL endpoint and just paste it in here like we did last time. Now we get a unauthorized authentication required because we haven't provided this authentication information. So right here under authentication, it says we can use our access token. And immediately when we do that, we see we're getting the data. Now, in this case, what Toddle actually does when we says access token, so authorization here is not part of a standard REST request. This is specific to Toddle. So what we're doing here is saying when you make that request, we actually make that request from the Toddle backend. When you make that request, go and take that access token that you have securely stored and add that as an authorization header. So it'll add a specific header, and it'll add it on this format bearer and then the access token. So that basically allows you to store that token completely securely, but you can still use that to authenticate to third-party APIs, or in this case our Xano API, using in this case an authorization header, which is kind of the most standard, most common format for making that request on API, or for authenticating with an API, right? So we can see here we get the result back, and we get this empty array of data back, and that makes sense because we don't have any list. One thing to note is that if you're not getting this result right after you logged in, you might have to refresh your editor once to make sure it actually picks up all those cookies that were set on the other page. That can sometimes be an issue, so just make sure that you do give it a quick refresh. Usually it works, but that can be an issue to be aware of. So since we're not getting data, we don't really have anything to work with. So let's go back to Xano and add some items to our database. So here we've got a to-do. We actually got a lot of stuff here, but we're just going to get rid of that because none of it has a user reference, and then it wouldn't actually work if we didn't have it, right? So we need to add new ones that actually have a user ID, otherwise we're not going to get it back. That's what we told the API, right? So I'm going to add a new task. I'm going to call it, I think order pizza. We'll stick with that one. Pizza. It's not completed. It, I think, is important. Oh, apparently you can't. Space. There we are. And then for user, I'm going to add use my user, right? So that should be it. Let's go and try and do this. I'm just going to refresh the page and it should refetch. Let's go and check to-dos. And now we're getting this task back with all its data, right? So let's go and present that in a list. I'm going to add, we'll start by giving this a title, to-dos. I don't need a paragraph here. And then let's add here a list. And just like we did last time, we're going to right click, we're going to say repeat, and then we're going to pick our to-dos, misclick, and data, right? And that's what coming back, the data, so we don't need to go any further. Just remove these extra default items. And now we can choose our text, put in here what is the item task, and it says order pizza, right? We're also going to here inside this add a input. And the reason why I'm adding an input, that might seem a little bit weird, but actually in HTML, checkboxes and input are the same element. It's just, you just add type checkbox. Which, to be fair, is really weird, and I don't know why. well, let's just do 32 by 32, right? Why that was designed like that, but that's the way it is in HTML. We are gonna align our li horizontally. We can change the layout direction here. As we talk about with Flexbox, we're always doing layout in either a column or a row, and we want this to be a row. We then use this alignment tool here to align it like in the center, so they're equally aligned. You can see we can sort of change the alignment for the items here. And lastly, I'm adding an 8-pixel gap to just give you a little bit. Now, I think this checkbox might be just a little bit on the aggressive side, so maybe let's go and say 16 by 16. I think that's a little bit better. So with checkboxes, when you have an input that of type checkbox, we don't actually use the value attribute. We use the checked attribute instead. And we're going to set that to the item. And you can see as soon as we started setting it, this now shows checked. And then we're going to set it to completed, and it gets unchecked again, because completed is false, right? And if you remember, we mentioned that any value that is not false or null is considered true if you're trying to force it into either true or false, right? So now what we want to do is when we click this this checkbox, we actually want to not so much set true or false in a variable, just like we bound other inputs. We want to make a request to the Xano database and say, hey, or the Xano API, and say this input is now updated, right? So we are going to create a new API called update to do, and we're going to go and grab that from our to-dos here. That's going to be the post to do /id. So I'm going to pick that one and then copy the endpoint URL right here. And so you'll notice here that we're missing this bit ID, right? This is sort of being passed by URL, right? But this is sort of, this bit was intended to be the actual ID, like not like curly brackets, right? So we need to put in the actual ID of the item we wanna change. And so we need to be able to fetch that from within a formula here. Now the problem is, of course, we don't know here which one the user clicks. It could be several. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a variable right here called selected to do, right? It's going to start out being null, which is null is sort of the empty value. It's not quite the same as false, right? False means no, essentially. Null means there could be something here of any sort of, whether it's a string or number, but right now there's nothing here. And it's also not quite the same as a variable not existing. We created the variable, but we said you shouldn't have any value. It should be empty at this point, right? And so when I'm clicking this, I'm going to add a, well, we're actually going to add a change event, because it's similar to a click event when you click it, but you can also, if you focus the input, press either space or enter, and it'll also trigger the change event. It's a little bit like input in text inputs. The difference is if you have a text input, the input event will trigger every time you type. The change event on a text input will trigger anytime you tap away from an input field and it has been changed, or when you press enter. So you can sort of decide how often do I want every keystroke, or do I want it just like this has now been changed and user's done changing. For checkboxes, there's really only one thing you can do. So we're just going to use the change event. So when that happens, we're going to set the selected to do, and we're going to set it to the, what are we going to set it to? We're going to set it to the repeat item, right? So this item, the whole to-do item, we're just going to put that into that variable. So whatever item we click on, that's the one that's now stored there. And then we're going to call our update to-dos. So let's go to update to-dos and make sure that's configured right. So since we just set that selected to do, and actually let's go and do that. We'll click it once, right? Since we just did that, let's go and check update to do. It's going to throw an error because we did try to call it, and actually it obviously we didn't finish the request, right? But here in the ID, we can now use a formula. So this part of the path, right? We can now use a formula again. We're going to say selected to do ID, right? This should not be autofetch. That's probably also why it's wrong. Post. There we go. There shouldn't be a get request. It's a post because we are updating, right? And then in the data we're updating, let's have a look at that. We can update a few of these, but we know it only really cares about the Boolean call completed, right? So we are going to add in here an object again. Object with a completed, and the value should be the selected to do and then completed. And then since we're clicking it and we're making a change, it should be the opposite of that. So if it's false, it should be true, and true, it should be false. We can do that by adding a formula node called not, which basically means not whatever it was before. Like, so if it was false, turns true, vice versa, right? So that should do it. Let's give that a shot. I'm gonna click that now. Well, let's just refresh it to be clear. Give that a quick refresh, and then we're gonna give it a click, and then we're gonna have a look at our API update to do. It says unauthorized. Of course it does, because we forgot to add our authorization header. That always needs to be there. Let's just give it a quick refresh again. And then we'll click the to-do, and we go back to our update to-do, and it says done. It totally updated that to true, right? So now if we refresh, this little box should be checked. Let's give that one more go, and it is checked, right? Right, so now we've fetched our to-do items, and we can click the box to check the to-do. Now, we could technically consider if we should be able to click the whole thing. I'll leave that up to you if you want to create different ways of doing this, right? Now, the last thing I want to add here is the ability to create new to-do items. I think we'll call it at that point. So it'll basically be an input. You can type in. When you hit enter, it'll create a new to-do item for you and add it to the list, right? So I'm going to add here an input. We're going to move that up to the top, just below the heading. There we go. And let's just actually go and wrap this whole thing. We'll just wrap it in we'll use a main element. So main is whenever you have an app, main sort of says this is the primary part of the content, right? Your page should only have one of them. They are not obligatory, but it can be really good, especially if you have content where you're saying this is not the core part. So let's say you're doing a blog or something. The actual article should be in part of your main, but maybe like other stuff, etc., and like links to different places, maybe that's not what you would say. That's not really what this page is about. So I'm going to leave that outside. So we got the main. We're going to put that in. So the reason why I wanted to wrap this is because now I can kind of say, well, actually main should be a width of, let's say, 600 pixels. That's a bit much still, 500. And with a max width of, let's say, 100%. So basically never go wider than the screen. This input field, we're just going to change that to width 100%. And now it's all very much stacked up together. So we can just take main. We just add a gap of, let's say, 8 pixels. That adds this gap in between every single part, right, of these elements. So I think that works well. For the new one, the new input we've created, just like we did with the login inputs, we're going to create a variable called new to do. We called it task, and we'll just call it new to do. That's fine. We'll change that. Removed it so there's no default, right? And an input will then go and bind this to our new to do, right? And with text inputs, password, all this, bind just works just fine. You can't actually use bind with an input type checked, again, because its value is set differently, right? So for this input, that's all good. The last thing is that when you submit this, so we could actually add a form here, and actually maybe we should go and add. Let's do that. Let's add a form. We'll just cut all this out from inside. We'll move it up here and put the input inside, right? Let's take it to a form, because it's generally good whenever you have data where you're like inputting it and then submitting it. That is really what forms are for. It's good style to sort of keep that going, right? Even though we literally just have an input. And I don't even really want a button that says create, because I feel like you just hit enter, and that's kind of the flow I'm going for, right? So we are going to again add the submit event here. And now we're going to essentially go and say, well, go and create a new task. Oh, let's just go back to the form. I want you to create a new task. We haven't actually created that API yet. So let's maybe go back and do that, right? Let's check out Xano on our API. We're going through to do. And we post to do to create a new to do. That makes a lot of sense, right? That's our /to do post. And you're going to give it the task, completed, important, and the user ID. Though the user ID is not actually required here, because if you remember back when Michael was here, we said the user ID is always going to be the auth ID. So it's always going to be the one who did it, not actually, you can't actually send that along, right? So we are going to copy that from Xano. And then we're going to go back to our toddle app, and we're going to create a new API called add to do. This is going to be a post. We're remembering this time, and we're pasting this. Don't need to add any ID because obviously we haven't created the task yet. Again, in body, we're going to create an object. So here, every time I'm adding these objects, these toddle objects, right? They will automatically, by default, be converted into JSON before sent away to that API. So you don't need to worry about like JSON conversion, right? You can also, and you can see here by default, the content type here says application JSON. You can change that to other ones, like JSON is by far the most common, but you can also go and set something like form URL encoded. There's a whole bunch of these MIME types, they're called, of kind of data. And the API really dictates here, right? You gotta speak the language the API understands. So there are other type of encoding. JSON is just the most common, right? Here I'm gonna add what we call a task, was the first name, and we call that our new to do, right? Then it was completed. We're gonna set that, and that's not something, we'll start as false, right? Like we're not setting, there's no variable for that, because we don't want to be able to pick if it should start out completed. It doesn't make any sense. Important, we are gonna ignore for now. It makes a lot of sense to have it, but I don't think we'll cover that in this video. And the last one was user ID, and again, we don't need that. So now we've got our task completed and important, right? And of course, this time we're going to remember adding our auth. Good. So now let's go and check. We've got the form going. That should all be okay. I'm going to go into test mode and I say, clean my room. I'm going to hit enter, and as so often in this case, nothing happens, but maybe it actually did. Let's go and look at the API. Add to do. We've got nothing. Did we? Because we didn't call it. Obviously, we didn't call it from the form, right? We just say prevent default. So we are going to call add to do. And actually, in this case, I do think we want to do a few more things. So I think when we're successful, I think we should reset this input so you can add another one. So I'm going to go here and say set new to do, and we're just going to clear that out so it's an empty string. And then one more thing is that right now we've created that to do, but we're still listing the ones we got from the to-dos request, right? So just because we made another request to the server doesn't mean that the to-dos request is going to change. It doesn't know about it, right? If we're changing the parameters of that request, it'll know to refetch, because that's how autofetch works. But this is an event that happened on a completely different server somewhere. So there's no way this API can know that that happened, right? So we need to tell it, hey, you should actually refetch when that does. So I'm going to go and say add to do. Whenever that happens, on success, nope, that's not here. We did it inside the formula. That's also fine. When we do submit, we're going to say on success for that add to do. We're going to reset this new to do. And then we're going to call to dos, right? So what's going to happen is it's going to call the server saying, here's a new to do item. Then when it comes back, it's going to reset this input and it's going to refetch the list, right? So let's go and give that a shot. Clean my room. And it creates a new item and adds it to the list. And I can add another one. Record more 7 days. Oh, toddle in videos. And it'll add that in. And for each of these, I can check them off as completed, right? Right. So that was definitely a bit of a longer video, but we also covered quite a lot. We covered how do you set up a backend in Xano. Again, thank you very much, Michael, for helping us with that bit. We covered how you do sign up, login, authentication, and toddle, how you set your secure token using a session cookie with toddle, and how you fetch that when using, or how you can use that in future API requests to make sure that you're making authenticated API requests to your backend. We also covered, of course, how to actually build a to-do list, even though that was a surprisingly small part of the video. And of course, we learned a little bit more about how to work with workflows, variables, etc. I hope you liked the video. Definitely go and try it out yourself. There was a lot of things we didn't cover. We didn't let you edit the to-do list. We didn't let you delete items. There's a ton of things you can add to this. Of course, we have this whole important property that we didn't touch on at all. So I hope when you go and try this yourself, play around with that a bit, add some features we didn't see, how far you can go, right? And please come in on our Discord and share these projects with us. We really love to see everything you're building. Tomorrow, or at least the day after today, we are going to be taking this whole logic up a step, right? We are going to be looking at building a blackjack game, which is going to be a little bit more complicated than what we've seen so far. But at this point, if you watch the videos until now, you'll definitely be able to do it. It's going to have a lot of logic. We're going to be really using the formulas a lot. We're going to be using the workflows. We're going to use variables, all these things. So stay tuned. Remember to subscribe so you'll get notified when our videos come out. We've got more coming in the series, and I promise by the end of it, you'll be a toddle developer that can take on pretty much whatever project it is you're looking at. Right? Thank you very much for watching, and I'm looking forward to the next one.